Hey folks, we'd love to get started again, get you out of here at a reasonable hour. I am having the time of my life, but of all the panels that I've prepared for today, all the fireside chats, this is probably the one that's nearest and dearest to my heart, and the one that I've really poured a lot of intellectual energy into, so I really hope you come and join me for this. So please, if you could round folks up and bring them into the main room, they will not want to miss this. This I promise you. All right, anyone else? Come on. Everyone else out in the hall, come on in. All righty, I guess that's going to have to do it then. You're not going to want to miss this, I promise. All right. Hey, so I hope you're all having a good time. Once again, I am Kaiser, and I'm the host of the Sinica podcast, part of the China Project, and it is my great honor to be delivering, moderating this last and final panel of the day. I'm sure many of you saw that Evan Osnos of The New Yorker published a piece last week in that August magazine that sparked quite a bit of conversation within our community, within the people who care a lot about China. He talked about an age of malaise that has set in across China, and while much of it, to be honest, really did resonate with me, it resonated also with people who, because of the conversations I've had with the many people who have been back to China since the post-COVID reopening, or indeed never actually left China during COVID in the first place. The most frequent critique, though, of that piece that I saw, well, in fact, that was delivered by many people, among whom was Taisu, who's on stage with me right now, was that it focused almost entirely on elites. That is a fair criticism. That may be a very fair criticism. But it's also, I think, very important to note that elite opinion actually matters, and that it matters perhaps more in China than in most other, perhaps any other country. China, with its self-conscious strata of 知识分子, of people who regard themselves self-consciously as part of an intellectual class, it has a long, enduring tradition, a cultural reflex, I would call it, of privileging knowledge elites. These are people who both see themselves as, and are seen by the rest of society as, having a special place as the conscience of the Chinese civilization, as having an inherent right to access to channels of consultation with political authority. So this afternoon, I want to explore where the intellectuals of China are today. Where is the mind of contemporary China? I think there's real urgency in exploring this question right now because Chinese intellectuals find themselves at a very important crossroads right now. It's not just about their attitudes towards Xi Jinping and his tightening authoritarianism. It's not just about the property market or about youth unemployment or about many of the other economic problems that beset China these days. It's actually much bigger than that. What do I mean by that? In my way of thinking, and this really owes much, it owes really everything, to the ideas of the late Joseph Levinson, who was a prominent intellectual historian of China who died in the late 1960s, tragically. In his way of thinking, in my way of thinking now, for the last really 180 years, since the Opium War and China's first brutal and sort of traumatic encounter with a militarized and industrialized West, one great all-consuming question really dominated the minds of Chinese intellectuals. Every ism that was created or imported, that was endorsed, every ology, every system of thought that was taken up by different Chinese intellectuals was, in a sense, an answer to this great overarching question, and at the same time, a negation of other possible answers to that. What is that question? It is something like, how do we obtain national wealth and power and do so in a way that somehow reckons with our Chinese tradition, our Chinese identity, with Chineseness itself? That is the essential question. And that's driven, like I said, all of the systems of thought that have crossed the intellectual and political stage in China across this 9 score years. But now what? I mean, however ad hoc you might regard this system of hodgepodge, improvised Confucian, Leninism, technocratic authoritarianism, however bizarre this chimera is, to an extent, it has answered that question and has worked. It has delivered wealth and power. Wealth, okay, we might not accept Xi Jinping's claim to have thoroughly eradicated extreme poverty in China, but there's no denying that it has been significantly abated in that time. Power, there is little question that the Chinese Navy may still actually be dwarfed in terms of tonnage by the U.S., but in terms of the number of naval vessels it possesses, it's actually the biggest in the world. China has found a way to modernity, as we are so often reminded, with Chinese characteristics too. Somehow, without many of us really remarking on it, then the great question of modern Chinese history has been answered. The grand quest completed, not quite to the satisfaction of all, but to, I would assert, enough, to a critical mass, such that we should all be wondering, what is the next question? What is the next China? Coincidentally, the title of our so what is the question? If modern Chinese history was dominated by that question of wealth and power, what is the postmodern question? This is something that has obsessed me for some time. So here at the Next China Conference, I am putting that question to Isa Ding from Northwestern University and to Taisu Zhang from Yale University. He teaches law and history there. I asked Isa and Taisu to join because they are two of the scholars who I know who are in touch with and who engage deeply with currents in contemporary Chinese thought and can talk about those ideas and make them not just intelligible, but really palpable, I think, to English-speaking audiences. So before we get started, let me note, I am aware, as are the panelists, of the perils of making big generalizations about a group as enormous and as diverse as Chinese intellectuals, but take this as a throat clearing and a caveat that shall remain in force for the remaining 36 minutes and 42 seconds of this conversation. So the alternative, of course, is that we say nothing of consequence, nothing of interest at all, and screw that. So there are going to be plenty of exceptions, and no, what we say is not empirically tested, but it will be informed. And I hope you will find it valuable. There's so much that I'd like to get into about Chinese intellectuals today, their relationship with modernity, with technology, with the party state, with the West, and especially with the United States, with their own compatriots, whether in Xinjiang or in Tibet, in Hong Kong, in the thinking of many of them, their compatriots in Taiwan, their relationship with China itself, with the Chinese identity, with Chineseness, their sense of their own role in society, and of course, the big question, what is the next big question? So let me start with something. I'm going to switch over to here now. Let me start with something fundamental. And first of all, a warm round of applause for Isa Ding and Taisu Zhang. Isa, since Mao's death and the beginning of reform and opening, the landscape for intellectuals has changed rather appreciably, you might say. Close to 20% of all Chinese aged 25 to 34, I think, now have a 4-year degree. And that's astonishing, 20%. And that, by the way, a 4-year degree is sort of the unofficial sine qua non of membership in the 知识分子 as a member of China's self-described intellectual elite. So in gross tertiary enrollment, it went from 3.4% in 1990 to almost 60% in 2022. Try to imagine that, from 3.4 to 60% in 2022. There has also been a democratization of voice that, albeit constrained by censorship for sure, we understand that. But the internet has really bestowed on a lot of people sort of this gift of participation in the national discourse as well, and people of all educational levels. So, has the intellectual's role been diluted by this, both in the way they conceive of themselves and the way that the rest of society conceives of them? Or have intellectuals' voices actually found amplification because of these exact same statistics that I've just cited?
No, thank you for the question. Please cut me off because we don't have a lot of time. So I'll just get into my answer. I like to start from first principles, which is the definition of intellectual. There's no definition. There's no one answer, one definition according to everybody who's tried to define intellectual. So when the CCP first took over, intellectual, by the way, was a class, right? It was, regardless of whether it was self-conscious or not, it was a status strata. It was a strata, if not a class, right? Under Mao. And so when the CCP first took over, the category to become intellectual, I think, was high school education, but then they couldn't find enough people, so then they lowered it to primary school education in some parts of China. So this category keeps changing, and I think, so it's really impossible to define who's intellectual, who's not. But we can think about what's anti-intellectual, and then when we think about what's anti-intellectual, then what's intellectual becomes more clear, right? So anti-intellectual is anti-reason, anti-science, anti-knowledge. Then we can define intellectual negatively as somebody who possesses or produces knowledge through reasoning, through rational reasoning, and then based on their trained expertise. So then it comes to the question, okay, right, setting aside the question of who's an intellectual, what is their role? Has the role been diluted? Well, it depends on what the role is. And I think we might get into that later in the conversation, but I think your question about the rise of technology and then the social media, and then everybody, being able to portray themselves as a thought leader on the block sphere. So what does that mean? I think, and also the rise of education, I think it's important to note, and I'm of the view that Chinese society in general, I'm talking about the common folk, nowadays is quite anti-intellectual or more anti-intellectual than they were 15, 20 years ago. So 15, 20 years ago, everybody, and this is a global trend, this is the same thing with the United States. 15, 20 years ago, everybody loved rich people, looked up to rich people. Everybody, thought a Tsinghua degree, a Beida degree was a big deal, but it's no longer the case. And oftentimes, common people will look at rich people, look at people with status and fancy degrees with contempt, if not hate, for the lack of better terms. And I think this is what I'm seeing. The broad societal zeitgeist of the today. Even though many of my political science colleagues disagree, they think there can't be populism in an autocracy. There can't be populism in a non-democratic society. But I think that there's a lot of populism in China today. There's a lot of anti-intellectualism. So to kind of answer your question, has that diluted the role? Sure, it's not. Sure, definitely. I don't know if it's delusion, right? If it's the roles being diluted, diminution. Yeah, and I think so it comes from both the state and society, but that doesn't mean the intellectuals are not trying to do something about it or not trying to work within the limited space that that they're left with.
Yeah, very much. I want to turn to Taisu and ask you about ideology in the NEXTChina. The Chinese state is ruled by a party whose ideology it was for a while fairly easy to dismiss as just sort of mere lip service, right? We understood that they thought it was sort of a load-bearing law. They needed to pay lip service to Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, to the legacy of Mao himself, because to not do so would sort of cut them off from a source of legitimacy. But we all sort of knew that deep down they were just pragmatists, right? They were technocrats, Leninists maybe, but without Marxism. Now, with wealth and power largely attained, though, it feels like ideology might be making something of a comeback. Liberal intellectuals, doubtlessly, they bridle very much at all the sloganeering, the new patriotic education law. But what about the establishment intellectuals? I mean, Wang Huning is a bona fide intellectual, like him or not. He sits on the Politburo Standing Committee, again, reaffirmed there in the 20th Party Congress. What do we make of this and the role of the party intellectual?
Great. So first of all, thank you for having me here. Looking forward to this conversation. So starting with Wang Huning himself, right? Wang Huning is a very interesting figure in the sense that Wang Huning is very obviously intellectual, but it's kind of hard to say whether Wang Huning is actually ideological in the traditional sense of the word, right? The fact that the guy has managed to survive and constantly rise up in status across 3 different regimes, I think almost kind of tells you, like, he's not known for sticking to a single set of ideas and working those ideas to their logical, logical ending point. If he did that, I'm sure he would have been. I'm sure his career would have ended by this point. It's his malleability that defines him. And if you look across like the broad range of writings that he's produced over the past 30 years, either speeches or academic writings or so on and so forth, there isn't a ton of common theme. Like the common theme seems to be some kind of like nationalism, but this is, I think, the part where he probably represents a large stratum of Chinese intellectuals, or a part of the Chinese elite, which is that the kind of nationalism that you see in China is more easily negatively defined than it is positively defined, right?
Once again,
right.
We're doing a lot of negative definition here today. It looks like.
Right, but in this case, it's not negative definition against a set of ideas. It's more a negative definition against imagined adversaries, right? Right now, obviously, most notably the U.S. In past decades, Japan played the role of boogeyman from time to time. There are points in which various other entities, including the Soviet Union at various points, were the perceived boogeymen. And that's how it tends to define itself. Like, it's a constant, never-ending stream of grievances against outside adversaries. But if you ask them what exactly is the core value set that this nationalism itself is meant to positively embody, you will likely get as many variations of answers as there are factions amongst Chinese intellectuals, and as we all know, there are, like dozens, if not hundreds, of factions, just amongst the establishment and academia intellectuals.
Right.
So in some ways, like, I've always thought of Chinese nationalism more as a kind of vibe than as an actual system of ideas. Like at any given time, the vibe could contain ideas. They're just not systematized in any permanent way. And you can contrast this with the state of Chinese ideas or ideological thinking in, say, the pre-1911 or the pre-1949 era. And those were eras that were marked by very definitive worldviews with systemic ideas wrapped into like a pretty neat bundle that at least like a very large chunk of the elite very carefully abided by. Nowadays, I mean, yes, there are schools of thought that have more or less pronounced ideologies, but across the entire landscape, but especially the guys in power, especially if you look at what is the ideology of the people who actually wield political power in China, like even to this day, it's kind of hard to say what that is. There was a joke that back when I was in law school was commonly told amongst my friends who came over from China, which is that at that time there were 3 kinds of people amongst Chinese intellectuals. There were rightists, i.e. liberals, and there were leftists, and then there were the guys in power. So there were 左派,右派和当权派, which kind of tells you, like, I think that was true back then. It's still true now, even if the 当权派, even if the guys in power have a more pronounced kind of like nationalist vibe to them.
So we've talked quite a bit about nationalism. I want to dig down into this a little bit because I think it's fair to say that the type, and I think you've accurately described it, the kind of nationalism, recent vintage nationalism of the last couple of decades could be described as kind of garden variety reactive nationalism, your century of humiliation nationalism, your chip on the shoulder nationalism, your aggrieved nationalism, right?
Yeah.
Pretty garden variety, run of the mill. We're all very familiar with it. I'm wondering though, now that we have kind of solved, as we are supposing, this century of humiliation bit, will it shift from essentially defensive to a more offensive kind of nationalism? Will it be a nationalism that punches no longer up at perceived sort of bullying by colonial imperial powers and the powerful West, to a nationalism that, God forbid, punches down at and sort of is that nationalism of swagger, the nationalism that I find to be just much more ugly. So I want to ask you the first thing, please weigh in on yourself.
I think there's definitely this possibility, and I think when it comes to nationalism and where it is going, if you were to, I think if I could only say, one thing that would be, it really depends on the leaders. I think society oftentimes mimic the guys in charge in terms of how in terms of how one expresses their nationalism. Again, this is not unique to China, and I think in with the mannerism and with the style of the current leadership, I definitely see there is the potential for switching from more defensive to the more imperial swagger and condescension, regardless of whether there is actually confidence inside, right? And I right now I'm of the belief that public opinion is extremely malleable, so it can change within a few hours. It can change, as we've seen during COVID. So my view is that where nationalism is going, insofar as there is no big crisis and opening, right? There is no this open space for different ideas to contend, right? If there is, like that was around 1911, then you'll see a different type of nationalism. But I think insofar as ideology and the shape of nationalism is shaped by those on top, I actually do believe there is the potential. I don't think they're there yet, but I think one can simply just watch how often the leadership and those in power use the term or invoke, for instance, the non-interference principle, right? Like they still do that, but I don't know. I mean, I've not counted, right? But I think I haven't seen this in a while, right? So there's definitely it does seem like this non-interference principle. If it was 100, you use 100 out of 100 times, now it's 80, 90, right? So I think it's very easy to watch the leadership, and then in terms of public opinion, I just find people mimic, in terms of general, the common folk, they just mimic whoever is the president.
So the common folk mimic who's in power. What about intellectuals? I mean, they certainly don't always mimic. In fact, many of them are very much at odds with the man in power right now.
So intellectuals tend to define themselves against the state more than they define themselves with the state. I think traditionally up until pretty much like 2008, that was clearly the case, right? Nowadays, I'm not so sure, but even nowadays, I think the guys who are willing to run with the state very closely are in the minority. Just going back to the point on nationalism, like the one thing I wanted to say is like this. How strong the party feels at any given moment seems highly variable these days, right? If you asked this question 2 years ago during 2021, the answer is definitely, right?
Yeah, we would have had a very, very different
conversation. Clearly the party leadership was feeling emboldened enough that it was trying to reach out much more aggressively, not just vis-a-vis Central Asian countries or Southeast Asian countries, but also vis-a-vis European countries. And then even towards the U.S., there was a certain kind of air of not quite superiority, but at some point inevitable superiority down the road. I think that the damage to the leadership's self-confidence done by the past 2 years has actually been quite substantial, right? And so nowadays, the tone is softer, especially during this recent Israel-Hamas conflict. It's very obvious, right? That they're picking up all the old like rally the global south kind of rhetoric that was popular in the 70s and 80s again, and they're trying to use it to some effect. Vis-a-vis the U.S., I don't think necessarily that they still think that time is on their side when it comes to economic balance. And so overall, right, the tone has again begun to become more defensive, which tells you, right, like if at any given point in time something happens that makes them feel materially emboldened, it's probably going to shift more towards the aggressive again. But in the end, it depends on how they sense their own material standing in the world, more than any kind of like firm ideological commitment to either aggression or defense.
So I don't necessarily treat what's happened in the last couple of years as evidence that maybe it hasn't answered that former question. In fact, I might think of it as sort of evidence that it has, that we've moved on. This whole discourse about Neijian involution, the whole discourse about lying flat, the whole repudiation of 996, it feels like distinctly postmodern. It feels like maybe could this be the fundamental layers of Maslow's hierarchy of needs having been met? Now the Chinese intellectual is reaching up for eventually self-actualization, more spiritual needs, and what have you. You're shaking your head.
Yeah, no, I definitely don't think so. Well, first is I don't think the needs have been met. I think most people, the needs also grow. I think it again depends on what we it depends on what we mean by intellectual, right? So like the people who are lying flat. When we say lie flat, right, we're talking about young people,
right,
college graduates. I mean, they don't.
I'm not talking about that phenomenon, but just that is part of the zeitgeist right now. That is part of the discourse. That there is a sort of.
Yeah, I think there is the Zhuangzi way of lie flat, where you can afford to do it, right? Like you lie flat because you choose. Although I think like
the Taoism of privilege.
Right, but I think it's not just that, because they did try, and it was there's a reason Confucius was in power, right? Because it was useful for the regime, and anyway. But I think there's the Zhuangzi way of lie flat, and then there's the lie flat because the unemployment rate is between 20 and 46%, and I definitely don't feel like China and Chinese, either youth or elites have entered this post-material stage of the Lasso's needs. And if you look at anyway, I've so much to say, but let Taisu.
No, I was just gonna say, like, I completely agree. I don't think, like, right now any notion of lying flat is because their needs have been met to their satisfaction. It's because they've lost any realistic hope of rising in class stature or social stature in the near future, right? It's more giving up than this part is good, let's move on to the next part. And in some ways, right, like there's a lot of intellectual lying flat too, right? As far as I can tell, Chinese intellectuals teaching at elite universities have given up trying to comment on politics, trying to have defined political messages for the party leadership, right? You talk about lying flat. In some ways, like that attitude of lying flat is more pronounced amongst PKU or Tsinghua intellectuals over the past year or two than I've ever seen it.
So that's what I was really getting at.
Yeah.
I mean, this has, it's climbed up into the real elite strata of these self-conscious members of the intelligentsia.
Well, I would dispute whether PKU or Tsinghua guys count as real elites, right? Like they're tolerated by the real elites, but they're not necessarily like a trusted part of that. The real elites.
So we inflicted some generational divides. I'm interested in the kinds of cleavages that we're talking about here when we talk about the intelligentsia. I think for a very long time it was possible to sort of look broadly at Chinese intellectuals and sort of place them along a single axis that sort of squashed down, where you had statism, where you had traditionalism, sort of, and let's call it sort of nationalism, all clustered on one end, and on the other side, free marketism, free market liberalism, where you had, the opposite number of nationalism, cosmopolitanism, say, clustered on the other. Does that still hold today? Is that the easiest way to understand the sort of dyad or has it gotten more complicated and polyhedral?
So first, I think, can I just add one thing to the last
Absolutely,
thing? I think the intellectuals outside of Beijing, they've not
They have intellectuals outside of Beijing.
Yes, there are intellectuals out, and so there are still
Why haven't I
channels.
met any?
They still try to. I think like with local governments, right? So you have so many provinces, each has their own universities, and they still. I mean, there are these internal channels, right? So they stop posting on social media, but there are still internal channels. They send policy proposals and so on and so forth. But anyway, getting to your question of cleavages. So it's important to note that the 80s generation, they're getting old, but they're not dead, right? It sounds very disrespectful and ageist for me to say that, but I'm actually referencing a Chinese joke, a recent Chinese joke, which concerns pop culture, entertainment, which I'm not going to get into, right? So they're getting old. So they were liberals, right? And they were constitutional or multi-party democracy liberals in the 80s, and some of them have left China. Others have stayed in China, and they're getting old, and some of them flipped, but there's still some who are left, right? Who are still thinking about the future of China. But by talking to them, what you realize is that unlike the 80s, right, the liberals or the back then liberals, they've come to the realization or conclusion, at least for now, that the party is here to stay. And then the likelihood for there to be multi-party competition is really small. So then how do you, still try to, be not completely a propagandist, right? Well, still trying to make China better, right? By thinking, right? And then how do you do that? Well, we can talk more about this, but there are these, now there's this new concept of modernization, Chinese-style modernization with Chinese characteristics is my preferred translation. So then if you look at what that, if you look at actually what the leadership says what that is, right? A list of different things, including harmony between man and nature, single-party rule, common prosperity for all, reducing inequality, peaceful development, right? And then there is this notion of whole process democracy. And I can say people within China, right? Smart people who are liberals in the 80s and have realized that the party's here to stay, they're actually thinking really hard about whole process democracy and what are some of the possibility, right? And again, China doesn't hate the concept of democracy, right? The democracy as a political category to describe the United States, it's a different thing, but the theory of the idea of democracy is in the middle of the 12 core socialist principles, right? So scholars are thinking, Chinese scholars are thinking about, okay, the Schumpeterian multi-party democracy is not possible. So then, what is this whole process democracy, right? Should we kind of develop mechanisms that's more Rousseauian, participatory? Should we develop ideas that's more Marxist, substantive, right? So they're thinking very seriously about this. It might seem, ridiculous from the outside, but they are thinking seriously about these questions, and trying to still, work their liberal mind within the possibilities that's left.
So, I want to turn to Taisu on this and picking up on a point that you made. It does to, I think, a lot of people who are unfamiliar with the realities of intellectual discourse in China. It does seem absurd from the outside that they would be thinking. I think, I want to ask you this, Taisu.
Thinking that China can become a democracy?
No, that whole process democracy should even count as a category of democracy. In other words, what I'm suggesting is this. Taisu, do you think that in the West, in our understanding of Chinese intellectuals, we over-index on the liberal intellectuals, on even the critical and even dissident intellectuals? My worry is that Well, I mean, obviously they are more accessible to us. Their ideas resonate with us. We feel deep empathy with them because, well, because
Yeah, of course.
But they don't reflect necessarily the sort of center of gravity of Chinese thought.
Right.
And I worry about that. And I
Right.
think that often leads to what I've come to think of as the quintessential American question about China, which is, why don't you hate your government as much as I think you should?
Yeah, I mean, most Chinese would probably ask the same question of a lot of American intellectuals.
Right. Fair enough. Oh, man.
But so I think, in the 1990s, there definitely was not like an over fetishization of the liberals section. Right, back in the 1990s, the liberals were, I think, dominant across every single possible dimension of Chinese society, whether in academia, whether in general intelligentsia, whether in the state or the party state, whether in business. Like everyone was more or less. It was just like liberals of different hues, except perhaps at the very top of the party leadership. Since I think around 2008, yes, like at some point, the way that we noticed this, or at least the way that my Yale Law School colleagues began to notice this, was that for a solid 5 to 6 year stretch, every single person that we admitted from China turned out to be a leftist. Some of them hit it better than others. But every single person that we admitted from China turned out to be a leftist. And at some point, the liberals in China were writing us angry letters complaining why the hell was Yale Law School, this big liberal bastion, producing leftist intellectuals nonstop.
Well, it's because they had been fed maybe a steady media diet of, Ai Weiwei and maybe like Murong Xuecun and Yu Hua and
Well, who's they? The guys who were complaining, or the guys
who were complaining.
Well, yeah, the guys who were there was a generational shift. I think the guys who were complaining came from the generation where everyone around them was thinking was pretty much thinking along the same ways, and then my generation, i.e., the people born in the 80s that Isa just referred to as old, began to become
born in the 60s
no,
here.
I didn't say born in the 80s. Not born in the 80s. I was born in I said the people who are in their 30s in the 80s. Sorry.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
All right.
So who were like in power
in the 80s. Okay, good.
Matured in the 80s.
All right,
That
sure,
went
sure.
on the square in the 80s.
All right, great.
Yeah.
But yes, like so the Baling-Hou like began to splinter more prominently, and I think like with every successive generation, the leftists in purely intellectual circles have become more prominent. Now that said, I've always thought of this right-left type divide as only making sense amongst basically academics, because no one else has the luxury of being cohesively leftist or rightist. Like the guys in the party state are usually like most of them come across as probably leaning liberal in terms of economic policy, but staunchly nationalist and staunchly supporting one party rule. They may or may not have that kind of like optimistic attitude towards whole process democracy.
I know quite a number of Chinese intellectuals in American academe who would describe themselves as liberal nationalists.
Yeah, I would.
I was getting at that.
Yeah. Sometimes I wonder how liberal I am, but yes. Nonetheless, so I do think there's a shifting of the center of gravity. I also do think that increasingly, yes, especially outside of academia, there's kind of like a muddling of the waters, where the fault lines between the two sides don't really make sense much for probably most people actually living outside of academia who are considered thought leaders of one kind or the other. So yeah, to answer your question directly, yes, I think the waters have become very muddied. I think right now, if Western scholars or commentators continue to focus only on the liberals, they're basically focusing on an increasingly small segment of the Chinese population. Yeah.
So in the interest of time, I want to move on. There's so much more I'd like to explore on that particular topic, but I want to talk about Chineseness. I think from their moment of their emergence on the public stage of the political stage, Chinese intellectuals have wrestled with their relationship with tradition of what it means to be Chinese. Where are we in that fraught struggle right now? We talked earlier about this modernity with Chinese characteristics. what's on offer out there? What are some people suggesting as ways to exist as a Chinese person, who is in harmony somehow with tradition? I know that, for example, your father is a very eminent scholar of Confucianism.
Yeah.
You yourself describe yourself as quintessentially Confucian. We'll get to that in just a liberal Confucian. No, not liberal. A liberal Confucian
just
nationalist.
said liberal nationalist.
Maybe liberal Confucian nationalist. But so how are they reckoning with it now? What is the answer on offer? What are some of the choices on offer?
I really want to hear Taisu's answer, but I think again, going back to this notion of what is Chinese, right? Is this question of identity, right? And it's the question that intellectuals and everybody's wrestled with, for hundreds of years, and everybody everywhere wrestles. And my belief and my theory is that. Again, going back to the negatives, identity, I might be too cynical to say this, but identity is usually negatively defined. So, Carl Jung, the famous Swiss psychologist, psychoanalyst, Freud's friend, and then their friendship broke up. So he had this notion of a shadow, right? So it's the idea that everybody has a shadow. Your frenemy, somebody you went to school with, right? You're constantly comparing yourself against, right? For you, it's probably Cui Jian, or not, no, Dou Wei, right? I don't know if it's over Wang Fei, but right? So everybody has a shadow, right? So if you
Jeremy Goldkorn.
So if you look down history, right? So if you look at when the Germans were thinking about their own identity in the 19th century, right? If you look at what they write, it's all about the British, it's all about French, right? Being German is how we're different from the British and the French. When the Russians were coming up with their identity, it was all about the Germans, right? And the Chinese was all about how our version of socialism is different from the Soviets. And if you just go all the way back, even to Pericles' funeral oration, right? It's the famous speech on democracy that he made to get Athens to go to war with Sparta, and he spent half the time talking about Sparta. How, their soldiers are forced to go to war, our soldiers willingly volunteer, right? So if you look at the way Chinese intellectuals or nationalist intellectuals and Americans talking about themselves, it's all how we're different from the other, the ideological other, and how we're better, right? So I think in this very case, perhaps I'm in agreement with you and Taisu in saying that, there is, to the extent that China is going back to tradition to find its identity, it's still this, it's driven by this need to distinguish itself from the United States. It's other, it's ideological other. And then, Taiwan doesn't have this problem, right? Because, right, Taiwanese identity developed vis-a-vis the mainlanders, right? So
shadow. Right?
It's shadow, right? So that's my answer to your question, but I want to hear,
answer.
yeah.
Taisu.
Right. Right.
We talked about Jung and we've talked about Freud. Let's get you on the couch and psychoanalyze your own relationship.
So I would say there's a difference between having a shadow, which, yes, everyone does have a shadow, and only having a shadow, right? Like, most of us have shadows, and then there's a chunk of us that's perhaps a bit more solid than just the shadow. And so, even Carl Schmitt would say that apart from defining yourself against an enemy or an outside threat, you also, over that process, have the possible hope of defining core values of your own positive
right, so let's talk
identity.
About the affirmative, positive content of Chineseness.
And I was going to say we don't have one.
Oh, shit.
Right. So I truly think that we don't have one. Like, I self-define as a Confucian of a certain kind. I think my ideology is dead in China. It's just dead. It's deader now than it was in the 1990s. I think, to the extent that there is a certain kind of reaching back into the past nationalism amongst younger people nowadays in China, it tends to be more aesthetics and a certain kind of vibe, like the way you dress, the way they imagine romance and martial arts or whatever, much more than any kind of concrete value. They tend to explicitly reject most of the values that you would associate with the past, either the small state ideology that dominated during the Ming and Qing, or like, dear God, filial piety is like definitely not anything that nearly anyone under the age of 35 would say they believe in, like not in that version. Any attempt to define core Chinese values by the party almost always falls flat. Sure. And especially when they try to reach back into the past, it's because the party can't make up its mind what kind of past it actually wants to use. Right? So I don't think we have a usable past in terms of values. I think we have a usable past in terms of perceived enemies, in terms of aesthetics, and in terms of perceived national grandeur, and so on and so forth. And again, there are vibes. I'm not sure there are values.
That Yasheng Huang is sitting here in the room with us, and he talked about this in his opening remarks this morning a little bit. Yeah. Could I invite you to come up, grab a microphone, Yasheng, and talk about this? Is there? I've got one right here. Come on up. It's okay. I'll surrender mine to you. Oh, thank you.
I'm a chair professor at MIT, but
there you go. Talk about that. I mean, I think it's important that we bring you into this conversation because you hinted at sort of an affirmative, positive content of elements of the Chinese past that can be repurposed to determine a future.
Yeah, I mean, they must be and they should be, but the issue is we're discussing this issue about Chinese intellectuals and different categories of Chinese intellectuals in an environment that doesn't have one element that is vital to intellectual development, freedom of speech, right? So we don't really know, in the absence of free speech, who are this kind of intellectual, who are that kind of intellectual. And we can't really...
But there's a huge community of people who are still engaged and are part of the Chinese discourse, who are outside of the reach of the censorious party.
Yeah.
Those of us in diaspora. And we're having this conversation. We're part of that conversation. Right? What are we suggesting?
But that's a separate conversation, right? So from the one that you guys are having, which is what type of intellectuals they are in China. In my own mind, I think it is not that I necessarily think that your past is always good. It's just that you have it. You just have to deal with it, right? So, I mean, the fact that I eat noodle more than spaghetti, there's no reason for that. It's just because I grew up in that environment and I stopped thinking about making that choice. And my point is to organize economy, to organize society, to organize politics, we actually need to exercise that thinking to say, oh, noodle is better than spaghetti or spaghetti is better than noodle. That requires some deliberative freedom.
Yeah, can I just add one thing to that, which is that I completely agree. Like, the past is always there. You never quite escape it. But the way that you process the past into concrete values is not a matter of habit. It's a matter of constant affirmative action. Well, I'm sorry. Affirmative action is the wrong word. It's a matter of constant affirmative formation and reinforcement, right? And that's the process which I don't think is quite existent vis-a-vis the Chinese past right now. Right, like we habitually eat noodles, we habitually eat rice, and so on and so forth. When it comes to whether those kinds of habits can be boiled into something resembling, to use your word, going back to the start of this conversation, an ideological worldview that has a system of values. I would hope that there can be such a conversation one day, but there doesn't really seem to be one right now.
So it seems like the regime. It seems like the regime wants to tap into tradition to form some kind of identity, but that's not my perception of what the intellectuals are doing. Right. I think, because I kept asking myself, as you guys were talking, so what is the American identity? it's democracy, right? It's democracy, freedom, right? So, no, that's not.
Yes, guns.
Well, but there is, okay. So then, I'm trying to think about, okay, what are the let's say the liberal intellectuals, to the extent there are still some left in China, are thinking about identity. I truly believe, politically speaking, right? We're talking about the political identity. I truly believe they're thinking about how to have democracy with a single party. Might sound ridiculous. Again, right, there are different definitions of democracy. Democracy, doesn't have to be a multi-party election. It's just like democracy as we see that, right? That democracy existing in the world are multi-party elections. But then there are different conceptions of democracies, and in both writing, thinking, and in practice, I see Chinese liberal intellectuals actually sincerely. There are people who are more, working on the propaganda, saying, "Oh, China is the actual democracy," right? That's different. There are actual sincere liberal intellectuals realizing that the party is here to stay, that we are in a single party regime, but we want to make China better. We still like the idea of democracy. So then what can we do, right? So outside of this, what are some of the other aspects of democracy or things, concerning equality, concerning involving people in the decision-making process? You actually see local policy experiments that are proposed by intellectuals that are happening in China. And there's a huge geographic variation of intellectuals as well in terms of what they think.
So, Isa, would you say that is the great question then before Chinese intellectuals today in China? Or is it maybe just one manifestation or one sort of facet of a bigger overarching question? What has come to replace the quest for wealth and power in the mind?
It's not. I think the quest for wealth and power is still ongoing.
Think
I
it's
think,
still ongoing?
to be honest, I think the big question nowadays is how to solve
you
the
reject the
economic
whole premise of
slowdown.
my-
No. I think there are big questions that. There are two circumstances under which people think about big questions, right? One is that they're really, they've all their needs met, right? They're a Yale Law School professor, right? So then they, lay flat and think about the big questions. And then there's the true crisis moment, right?
Also, I'm a professor. Yeah,
so the crisis moments, let's say the first decade of the, first few decades of the 20th century, we're not there. I don't know if I want to say yet, right? We're not there and we're not here, right? I think like in this moment, I know people who typically don't think about the economy or reading up on the economy, right? Trying to think about how do we solve the economic problems. I think that's the big question of the moment, in the sense that, that's just the people I'm talking to, yeah.
I may have to wait 20 more years then before I start writing this book.
Yeah. So yeah, I would say, it's still, I think underlying all of this is still various notions of wealth and power, but I think the question has kind of become, the big motivating questions for most intellectuals that I know has become, are we going to lose what we already have? Instead of how can we get more, right? There's a deep sense of insecurity that wasn't quite there a couple of years ago. And that sense of insecurity reframes the fundamental question, right? It's still in some ways wealth and power, but rather than how do we gain more wealth and more power.
Let's just pretend we're talking 2 years ago.
Right.
Let's pretend that the current age of malaise is not yet upon us.
All right.
And that we're in a moment where, China feels like it's hit its stride. It feels like it has had a V-shaped recovery. It's done better coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic than anyone else. It's ready to shift onto its post-carbon footing, as I like to say at the beginning of my podcast.
Right. In that case, it still would be wealth and power. Just how do we use our wealth and power to become number one, right? Like I don't think it's like this is why I kind of possibly somewhat resist this idea of like pyramids of needs, these like tiers of needs. As long as China is number two vis-a-vis the U.S., that wealth and power narrative is always going to be there. It's baked into nationalism, right? Like we're probably never going to get to the point where, materially speaking, we're the obvious number one. And so for as long as that happens, that wealth and power narrative is never going to completely go away, right?
So
final word to you.
yeah, so
You started this conference, you can end this conference.
yeah, so the V shape and all of that. It's very important to remember liberalism, not now, but traditionally has been the ideology of the weak rather than ideology of the strong. Now, in the established democracy, liberalism is viewed as the language and discourse of academics and powerful people. But traditionally, historically speaking, it was the ideology that the oppressed class used against the powerful, against the power holders. So it is not surprising after the Cultural Revolution, right? Izzadin was talking about the 1980s. After the Cultural Revolution, after the country went through this traumatic period, people began to believe in liberalism. Liberalism is about rights. It's about equality. So Kaiser, you may be like Politburo member. I may be nothing, but in terms of liberalism, we have the equal right, right? So implementation,
I've
sure.
never actually been a member of the Politburo. Just so you know.
Yeah, well, but you want to be, so I want to be. Right? So let me put it that way. But
Why stop there? Standing committee.
no, but yeah, oh yeah, but one thing at a time. And so liberalism, by its design, is actually protective of the weak. It has been abused by the system and all of that, but let's separate implementation from the design and from the idea. And Isa's point about intellectuals today accept the party rule forever and all of that, I think that's a very important precondition for how we think about that question, because people accept that as a unmovable situation, unmovable condition, then you have to think about the second best and the third best, right? In the absence of that constraint, I wonder if there are a lot of intellectuals in China in search of this kind of third way, this kind of Rousseau's democracy rather than constitutional institutional democracy, right? So I, in my own view, that in the 2,000 years of history, 3,000 years of history, at some point you stop searching, right? The fact is the human evolution has given us basically two functioning political systems, democracy and autocracy. All the other idea has been tried, has been thought about. Unless you believe you are genius, more genius than Einstein, why keep searching? Let's just accept what the history has told us. These are the two forms of the government. Let's choose one.
Not in human nature. I want to thank you all, for my two guests, Isa and Taisu, and Yasheng for coming back on stage and joining us. And I want to especially thank all of you for spending the day with us. I hope you learned something. I hope we gave you something to think about. I hope that you come and join us next year. And above all, I hope that you subscribe to our newsletter, subscribe to the podcasts, and continue to support the work that we do. Thank you very much. I'd like to have our CEO, Bob Guterman, come back on stage and join us for some parting remarks. Thank you.